racism definition analysis. Section 1, the shift in definition from prejudice to power. For most of modern history, the word racism carried a clear and narrow meaning: prejudice or discrimination against an individual based on race or ethnicity. This classical definition emphasized personal belief and action, a matter of individual bias. If a person denied someone a job, housing, or social standing because of skin color, that was racism. It was a moral and legal wrong rooted in observable behavior. This understanding dominated the public lexicon through much of the 20th century, including the early stages of the American Civil Rights Movement. It allowed for both condemnation of explicit acts, segregation, lynching, slurs, and protection of free association and expression where no discriminatory action occurred. It was a conduct-based definition, placing responsibility squarely on individuals. The Civil Rights Era Recalibration. In the wake of the Civil Rights Movement, particularly in academic and activist circles, the definition expanded to account for systemic factors. Racism was now seen not just as prejudice, but as prejudice plus power. The idea that racism required not only personal bias, but also institutional control capable of enforcing that bias. This post-civil rights revision reframed the conversation. It recognized that even without overtly racist individuals, laws, hiring practices, policing, and housing policies could produce racially skewed outcomes. Racism in this model was not limited to hateful acts. It was embedded in the structure of society. This was a critical insight for dismantling legal segregation and exposing discriminatory systems that had become normalized. However, this redefinition introduced a shift from observable acts to inferred systemic causes, making racism less about what was provably done and more about what could be interpreted from disparities. The scope broadened from personal behavior to include the architecture of institutions themselves. The contemporary expansion in the last 2 decades, especially with the rise of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion work, the definition has undergone a second major expansion. Today, in many public and institutional contexts, racism increasingly describes any perceived ideological opposition to DEI narratives, even when race is not the direct subject. This shift means that disagreement with a policy designed in the name of equity, such as race-based hiring quotas, admissions preferences, or curriculum mandates, can be labeled as racist, regardless of whether the critique references race at all. The focus has moved from prejudice, what you feel, and systemic bias, what the system does, to perceived disloyalty to a prescribed ideological position. A telling example. Consider a hiring policy that reserves a certain percentage of positions for applicants from underrepresented racial groups. An individual might question the policy on the grounds of meritocracy, cost efficiency, or legal compliance, without any animus toward the groups in question. In the contemporary definition, such dissent is often framed as racist, not because it expresses racial prejudice, but because it challenges an initiative labeled as anti-racist. This creates a linguistic inversion. The label of racism no longer depends on discriminatory intent or outcome, but on whether one aligns with a specific ideological framework. The term shifts from a descriptor of bias to a tool of boundary enforcement, marking the acceptable perimeter of public discourse. The stakes of definition. Definitions are not academic curiosities. They shape law, policy, and social norms. As the meaning of racism moves further from its classical roots, it becomes both broader in application and vaguer in evidence. This raises the risk that the term is used more as a rhetorical weapon than a precise moral or legal charge, which in turn erodes public trust in the concept itself. When words lose clarity, so does the ability to confront the genuine problems they once defined. Section 2, Mechanisms of Reverse or Ideological Racism. When anti-racism reinforces group stereotypes. Once the definition of racism expands from prejudice and discrimination into perceived opposition to a given ideology, the door opens to a paradox. The very policies intended to dismantle racial bias can begin reproducing its patterns in reverse. This is not simply a political talking point. It is a structural outcome of how identity-based policy operates when its premises go unchallenged. 1. Equity via disparity compensation. Modern DEI frameworks often operate on the assumption that any disparity between racial groups is itself proof of discrimination. This assumption short-circuits the inquiry into other possible causes: economic, cultural, geographic, or individual. Once disparity becomes synonymous with injustice, the proposed remedy is almost always preferential treatment for the group with the lower metric, regardless of whether the disparity is connected to present-day bias. The result: race becomes the primary lens for resource allocation, reintroducing identity as a determining factor for opportunity. This can inadvertently send the message that members of certain groups are inherently less able to succeed without intervention, a stereotype cloaked in benevolence. 2. Collective guilt assignment. Under the post-civil rights prejudice plus power model, the onus of racism fell predominantly on majority racial groups. In the contemporary ideological expansion, this logic is often applied with less nuance, producing blanket moral assignments based on group membership. Individuals are treated as proxies for historical wrongs, regardless of their own actions or ancestry. Example: a white immigrant whose family arrived in the US in the 1990s may be told to acknowledge their privilege and bear moral responsibility for systemic injustices predating their arrival, simply because they share skin color with the historical majority. Time round 3. Identity-based preferencing. When institutions prioritize filling quotas over evaluating qualifications, group identity becomes a hiring or admissions credential in itself. While justified as a corrective for past exclusion, this approach risks replacing one form of discrimination with another. A candidate can be passed over solely because they do not check a specific demographic box, even if they are more qualified. The irony is that this practice can trigger the same feelings of injustice and alienation once experienced by the very groups it seeks to help, creating fertile ground for resentment-based backlash. Social penalty systems. Perhaps the most consequential mechanism is the rise of speech and thought enforcement under anti-racist branding. Mandatory anti-bias training programs, for instance, sometimes present sweeping generalizations about racial groups as educational truths, such as asserting that one group is inherently fragile or oppressive in their interactions. Employees or students who challenge these premises risk professional consequences, public shaming, or formal complaints. The net effect is to pressure conformity not to fairness, but to an ideological orthodoxy, and to label dissent as moral failure. The ideological racism paradox. These mechanisms converge into a paradox. Anti-racist initiatives that define morality by identity categories inevitably create new forms of racial generalization. The logic is circular. The moment you question the fairness of the framework, your dissent is framed as proof that you harbor the very bias you dispute. This inversion doesn't simply alienate individuals, it entrenches a tribal lens through which every interaction is filtered. And once society begins sorting virtue and vice by demographic boxes, the line between fighting prejudice and enforcing it becomes perilously thin. Section 3. Social and political drivers. The expanded, ideology-centered definition of racism did not emerge in a vacuum. It persists and accelerates because it aligns with the incentives of institutions, media, activist organizations, and political actors. Each benefits in different ways from maintaining a state of racial and ideological tension. 1. Institutional incentives. Universities, corporations, and government agencies now employ large bureaucracies dedicated to diversity, equity, and inclusion compliance. These departments, often with budgets in the millions, are tasked not with solving a fixed problem, but with continuously identifying and addressing new ones. A narrow classical definition of racism tied to observable acts would make their mission finite. A broad, perception-based definition ensures permanent relevance. The more subjective the standard, the more justifications there are for expanding staff, programs, and training contracts. 2. Media polarization. Modern media operates on attention economics. Outrage drives engagement. Engagement drives revenue. Redefining racism to include ideological disagreement guarantees a steady flow of conflict-rich stories, campus controversies, viral clips, and corporate scandals that can be packaged into bite-sized outrage cycles. This isn't limited to one political orientation. Left-leaning outlets highlight opposition to DEI as evidence of entrenched prejudice. Right-leaning outlets frame DEI overreach as proof of cultural decay or reverse discrimination. Both sides benefit from the same definitional drift, because it feeds in-group loyalty and out-group hostility. 3. Activist sustainability. Grassroots and nonprofit organizations depend on a sustained sense of urgency to motivate donations, volunteers, and public attention. Once the clearest legal injustices are dismantled, redefining racism to include implicit or structural resistance keeps the cause alive. This redefinition also enables moral escalation. Each new perceived infraction validates the narrative that the problem is more pervasive and insidious than ever, keeping supporters emotionally invested and mobilized. 4. Partisan leverage. Political strategists have long understood the mobilizing power of identity narratives. By framing policy disagreements as moral failings tied to racism, parties can lock in voting blocks through solidarity messaging, discredit opponents without addressing the substance of their arguments, shift debates from policy details to moral absolutes where compromise is painted as betrayal. This tactic is not unique to one party or country. It's a recurring feature in political history, wherever identity is a lever for consolidating support. The self-reinforcing loop. These drivers feed one another. 1. Institutions create policies and trainings that broaden the definition. 2. Media amplifies controversies arising from those policies. 3. Activists frame pushback as proof of deeper systemic bias. 4. Politicians capitalize on the polarization to secure power. The result is a closed ecosystem in which ideological definitions of racism are both the fuel and the product of the system, a perpetual motion machine of outrage, funding, and control. Section 4. Consequences. When the definition of racism shifts from objective acts of prejudice to subjective ideological alignment, the fallout reaches far beyond academic debate. It begins to reshape how people interact, trust, and even perceive one another's motives. The cumulative effect is a society moving toward tribal fragmentation, where suspicion is the default and shared norms erode. Erosion of universal standards. One of the central achievements of the civil rights era was the codification of universal standards, the idea that laws and opportunities should apply equally, regardless of race. By tying moral standing to identity or ideological agreement, those standards give way to group-specific rules. Fairness is no longer measured by consistent treatment, but by whether an outcome aligns with a particular equity framework. Amplified intergroup suspicion. When dissent is interpreted as prejudice, conversations that once could have been civil policy debates become moral minefields. People begin to filter every interaction through the assumption that those from other groups are judging them through a lens of guilt or victimhood. This suspicion is self-reinforcing. The less people interact openly, the easier it becomes to caricature one another. Self-fulfilling segregation. Faced with the risk of being misinterpreted or vilified, individuals retreat into identity-safe enclaves, workplaces, communities, and media outlets where they are unlikely to be accused or challenged. Ironically, this recreates the very separations anti-racist initiatives were meant to dissolve. 4. Historical echoes. History is rich with examples of dominant moral frameworks that, once ascendant, imposed their own exclusions in the name of righteousness, from religious inquisitions to revolutionary purges. The expanded definition of racism risks becoming another iteration of this cycle. The moral language changes, but the underlying pattern, purity tests, loyalty enforcement, and sanctioned hostility toward dissenters, remains the same. Cause and effect flowchart. You can see the code in our conversation history. Why this matters. Now, if the term racism loses its precision, it loses its power to name and confront genuine prejudice. Instead, it becomes a political bludgeon, one that deepens division rather than bridges it. And once mutual suspicion hardens into group identity warfare, reversing the cycle becomes exponentially harder. In that sense, guarding the definition of racism isn't just a matter of semantics, it's a matter of social survival.